Hello everybody, it's Ronaldo again. Sorry for the long wait between YouTube videos. Just was very busy actually like writing stuff. I've been updating the blog a lot. I've been, working with Gray on some of the uh, finalizing the PDF for printing and that sort of stuff. So just haven't had a lot of time to sit down and record a video. And to be honest with you, I'm just not quite as good at that yet. This video will very much still be another uh, video editing is my passion kind of video, where it's very amateurish. But I thought we've got enough extra. I got enough new YouTube subscribers, and I haven't recorded one in a while that I could continue this little um, series on Game Master advice. This is going to be probably a relatively short video, but I always say that, and we'll see if that's true. So anyway, today I want to talk about creating rules or creating new adversaries for your games and sort of general guidelines on doing so. Um, I should point out when I say adversaries, I'm specifically talking about game master entities created with the um, adversary creation rules in the back of the main break book. Also, these are ones intended to potentially go into conflict with the players. Obviously, you have different considerations if you're making um, game master characters, game master entities that are intended to be allies or intended to be mostly like interactive kind of individuals. Um, they won't be the same considerations here. They actually probably have a lot less, um, but maybe one day we'll get into those. But for now, we're talking about the ones you want to fight. You're the the only reason being is that like even though I don't think it's always going to come up, it's good to know because it's one of the hardest things to come up with on the fly. So anyway, my sort of general guide. We'll start with my sort of general guidelines on here. The first being go big and make them memorable. And something this is something that like I'll say to people about almost everything when it comes to designing things for tabletop RPGs. If you have a game with an aesthetic that's permissive of it, and I'd say Break definitely is, um, it's don't worry too much about being over the top or cornball. Like first off, those things are generally boons in a game like Break, but also like you know people are going to remember a sort of big flashy monster or evil wizard or whatever you come up with. You should always be kind of aiming high. It doesn't mean every single one you come up with has to be this great big show. But try to, if you're making one, try to give it a reason to remember it, even if it's like even though if it's just like a sort of like mook enemy that is patrolling around a wizard's fortress, you can instead of making them kind of like generic voiceless soldiers or something, you can make them like puppets or animated fruit or something. Even if it seems wacky, um, if it's something that'll stick in the players' heads, I think it's something to go with. Um, a big thing I like to do whenever I'm coming up with new adversaries um, for like uh, you know anything I'm writing down is to kind of think of something I've been enjoying for a while, whether it be a video game or a show um, or like a book, and remember what made the antagonists in that fun, what made them fun or memorable. Um, and like, I kind of use that as a starting point, and then I kind of flavor it and work with on it to make it fit whatever idea I'm going with. But I think that's a good start. Um, and I said multiple things there because I also think no matter what you're, doing when it comes to working on tabletop stuff, it's always good to draw from multiple inspirations. These games are inherently sort of kludges of different things we all like, and I think it benefits um, to kind of reach beyond, the expected inspirations and pick out new stuff just to keep things from being a little recursive, right? You want to have fun with that. Sort of the tempering rule to go big is to focus and to go for fun gimmicks, but to keep it easy to manage. And you see, this is really important because I think like break is best when it's kind of moving quickly and doesn't give you too many plates to juggle in the air, right? So, and I think this is especially important too, um, because like especially a lot of like newer game masters, especially I've noticed, will kind of lean into like they'll be like, okay, I'm making a big important boss or encounter, I got to throw in this and this and this, and they end up making these really cool things, but they're really complex and they're difficult to run in the session itself. And so when you're making your kind of big adversaries and that kind of stuff, come up with a couple cool ideas. Like a good example of this is Laja from the main book, the Asura example. Um, Her abilities are pretty, they're pretty like advanced for like a break monster, but also they're still not too hard to keep track of. She has her various regular actions that kind of revolve around her taking advantage of her wretches that she's accumulated, and also like a couple of attacks she can do and a couple of ways she can heal herself. But the main thing that makes her a threat is her aura, which like inflicts status ailments on people around her. And because you can go at the beginning of a round, okay, guys, I need everybody to roll, your contest against her to see if this affects you. That's a lot of moving parts, but some of the work for that is being kind of like delegated to the players because they have to keep track of like, do I succeed in this check? Do I succeed in this contest? Or if I've been afflicted, what's that affliction doing to me? What's that affliction doing to my character? What can they do about it? That kind of stuff. And that allows you to keep that level of complexity, but it keeps things simple on you because then you only have to worry about Lodge's actions. Um, the risk of giving a character too many abilities or too many advanced abilities like that is that you're not even going to be able to use them. You'll lose track of them or you lose that and that kind of stuff. And I'm guilty of this too. In my home games, I've made a lot of really like complicated adversaries and stuff because I'm always like trying to one up myself and everything. And occasionally I've made an enemy that like I came up with several cool or I thought that were cool like abilities for, and only use like one or two of them, in the actual fight itself. And so keep that in mind when you're making things. If you have a bunch of cool ideas, you can always divvy them, save a couple and use them for different encounters down the line. Like, and that's going to be better anyway because again, it's going to keep them memorable. It's going to keep, it's going to, keep you from overwork and that kind of stuff. Um, and the gimmicks I can't stress enough. Like, you know, sure, it can be appealing to make a sort of Swiss Army knife creature that can kind of do a bunch of stuff. I think a lot of older versions of D&D's version of the Death Knight was definitely like this kind of Swiss Army knife monster who could fight, had all this armor, and also had a bunch of spells that they could cast. And like that was pretty fearsome and a good way to make a sort of like fun monster in that system. But like and because of that of older D&D, especially having this thing be sort of a hit point sponge, you kind of had to have it of a lot of things going around like that. But breaks a different game in a lot of ways, and so like you're better off kind of trying to focus a little tiny bit. So now that I've given you two, what I like to think is tempering suggestions, um, you know, like I call them tempering, but they might be contradictory. That's a your mileage may vary thing. My third sort of general suggestion is honestly, if you plan on running break for any extended period of time, not a bad idea to make a few easily adjustable or reskinnable monster or adversary entries, right? So like what I mean by here is to like come up with a few basic like setups like this is a fast warrior, this is a wily mage, this is a um, sort of like well armored foe and that kind of thing, and sort of come up with the basics there, and you can use those you can use those to build off of for future enemies. So, like for example, if you make a big armor knight that faces the player characters pretty early on in your saga, and like think of the maybe this big armor knight has like fairly heavy armor and like a lash weapon, and so they're difficult to deal for early characters to deal with because they can keep them at a safe distance and they have a high defense. That's a pretty good like adversary to work around. Maybe you intentionally make the armor much higher than or the defense much higher than the players can really expect to hit, so they have to utilize combat tricks, or they have to use assist attacks, or they have to find some way around this monster. But like obviously, down the line, this kind of creature is not going to really be able to hold mustard. Hold mustard. Is not going to really be able to hold off like more advanced characters. So instead, you might take this entry you made at the get-go and make like a fire knight out of it. So you change it and you keep the heavy armor, but instead of like a the lash weapon, they might have a arc weapon with fire damage properties or something like that. And like you buff up its ranks a bit so it has a higher heart total and attack, and suddenly you have a fun like armored fire knight for like a future adventure site and that kind of stuff. And obviously you don't want to do this with everything. If you just kind of use the same structure over and over and over again, it'll become obvious. That can be fun because it can be sort of consistency that the players can learn to expect and kind of strategize around. So that's not too bad. But like all things, use it in some level of moderation. That said, doing stuff like that really saves you a lot of work, which you're gonna, that's always good. And especially if you're someone who doesn't have new monster ideas constantly, or doesn't feel like focusing on that part of a particular adventure site, it's good to have a couple on hand. And you know what? Once you get particularly familiar with the game, you might even be able to like sort of adjust those entries on the fly. Um, but yeah, come to think of it, I should probably do a couple of those for the blog sometime. But that's not really what we're talking about here today. Anyway, so we're going to move on to the next set of advice. All right, so here's this is more like the others were sort of general advice. This is a little less structured. This is just kind of some thoughts I have. I guess that's all of this is some thoughts I have, but this is a little more loosey goosey, I guess. One thing, and I say this a lot: balance is important, but it's also not important. And I know that's a very unhelpful statement on the face of things, but let me get into it. Um, if you're coming from games like particularly like third edition of Dungeons and Dragons and onward, and other like sort of more granular tactical games, it's really important to keep some semblance of like balanced encounters, right? Because there's an expectation that the players are going to face those and deal with them in a certain way, and you need to make sure that it's fair and it's not only fair for them but also interesting and meaningful for them to deal with them. So in Break, you can play Break like that, and it'll work. It'll work pretty fine, and everyone, your group will probably have a good time if they're that kind of game. But it's also not an assumption with Break. I think that depending on how you play, you might have characters who are avoiding combat as best they can, or attempting to negotiate out of them, or attempting to nullify them some other way besides combat. So you don't always have to balance them exactly to be these sort of fair encounters. And also too, sometimes it's sometimes an encounter that's a little too easy and an encounter that's a little too hard um, are both really can both be really fun for characters. An encounter that's a little too easy can be good for characters who have advanced in rank, and the players can kind of feel how much better they are than they used to be. And I think that feeling of power is kind of fun. It's accomplishing. But also too, enemies that like encounters that are wandering around in an adventure site or even on your map as a random encounter um, that are a little too much for a particular party at a certain point in time, those can be nice reminders of alternate ways of dealing with things because you don't want to fight it directly. And also, it makes the world seem a little bigger, right? It doesn't make it seem like every place they go to is catered towards them. And I think both of those are valuable things to have. Um, it's also, there's a lot you can do with both those. Um, so the reason I say balance is important is because you don't want to throw in things that the players have to face head on that's just going to like just destroy them, right? You don't it's an easy thing to do as a game master to like just make these things too hard, especially if we particularly like the monster we make and that kind of stuff. So obviously that's a pretty basic thing, but obviously you want to keep track of that. And you also want to make sure that at least some of these encounters are difficult because if they're all too easy, um, that's not going to provide an interesting thing. If the players aren't making meaningful decisions during these encounters, it's even if they're not fighting them, it's not going to be too exciting. So that's really the balance that matters. Um, when I say it's not also not important, you don't need to have it exactly right every time. A lot of the times, the game is swingy enough that you can get away with being a little swingy on your end too. Um, you shouldn't feel too restrained. It's more of a like a casual thing. So if you find, if you can always dial things back or dial things up if you need to. So don't stress too much over this. Um, Another thing is to remember what an encounter is for. And so this one is a little more based on if you're making these, when you're designing a particular encounter, is this for an adventure site, right? Is this a guardian encounter? Is this a random encounter and that kind of stuff? And the reason why this is important is because I feel like there's different rules of engagement when it comes to encounters. Um, a guardian encounter is one that is assumed the players are going to have to deal with directly in some way, whether that is to trick them or sneak by them or take them head on, um, you know, or negotiate with them. Since the guardian encounters are sort of anchored to a particular spot on an adventure site map, that's something that when they move to that spot, they're going to see. And so it's important to remember, when making guardian encounters, where they are, what place do they occupy, and like what's their sort of general thing. It's so you got to remember that when designing those, and that comes into how that's balanced is different than an encounter that the players just don't necessarily have to deal with or might not run into. Um, Conversely, if this is like say a random encounter, which is something that the players might not meet, or you know, uh, also could show up in the middle of another encounter and that kind of stuff. Be considerate of those things too. So keep in mind what you are designing this encounter for as you design the encounter. It's easy to lose sight of that if you're too caught up in other details. And finally, and this is something I stress a lot, um, I have a lot of people like, they're really disappointed when the players figured something out or had some plan that quickly eliminated an encounter that they thought was going to be this big battle. And I actually think this is a good thing, under certain circumstances, obviously. I think it's actually really cool if the players are engaged enough in your game that they sat down and thought of a good enough plan or took enough investment to come up with a good enough idea or plan or use the tools around them to engage with something that they figured was enough of a threat to do so. And I feel like even though it doesn't quite feel like this sometimes, that means you did a pretty good job in designing that encounter. Um, and so, like, obviously, if that happens all the time, it wouldn't be as fun for you. But the two reasons why I don't think why it's a good thing and not that big a deal is one, it's just like I said, it also makes the players feel rewarded for taking that extra mile and to be smart and to try and play smart. And two, if they take down something that's big and dangerous without being able to use its abilities, you could just keep that adversary, like change it up a little bit and use it later, and you saved yourself a bunch of work. Just figure out what they did to take it out the first time and make sure that's not the factor again. Um, you know, obviously this isn't going to be universally true, but I don't think you got to worry too much about it. It's just something. This is just something I see a lot of people fuss about, and thought it would be a good thing to bring up during this thing. So we have our last bit of advice for the day, um, and this is some general advice for random encounter tables specifically. And so, just in case if you haven't gotten this far in the break book, or you might not have thought of it too much, or haven't read this part yet, random encounter tables is every map in break has a random encounter table. Well, I guess not settlement maps, but you could, if you wanted to give the settlement map a random encounter table, you could. It's just not assumed, like an adventure site or an adventure map, that kind of thing. And a random encounter is basically as you're traveling around and you hit certain um, qualifiers, the game master rolls on a random encounter chart to see if you ran into something that's sort of wandering around that area. And I think these are really important because, again, and I stress this a lot. It makes the map feel like a sort of organic place where things besides the player exist, and they exist outside of the player's behest. It's something I like to do too. It's fun. It adds a bit of randomness to things, and I like that. Even as a game master, I like when I don't know everything that's going to happen. Um, and so obviously you're expected to make a little random encounter chart for um, any map you create as a game master. And so here are some things to keep to sort of commit to memory when doing so. The first thing is to keep the location in mind. And this sounds obvious. If you're making a random encounter for a specific area, you're obviously going to, you're like, obviously, Ronaldo, I want to keep, the area in mind. But I also mean like beyond just like, oh, this is the sort of lore of this place. But like, for example, if um, your adventure site is a fortress of a particular faction, um, you're going to want to keep different things in mind for your random encounter chart than if it were, say, an ancient catacombs with like spirits and stuff in it. So like in a fortress, you're going to want the encounters to be the kind of people you'd walk in, bump into in a fortress, like so guards, maybe someone like a quartermaster or something like that, or like an official or other workers, those kind of people. Versus if you do that catacombs, spooky skeletons might be wandering around, a ghost or two, other adventurers who just happen to be poking around in the same place you are, um, that kind of stuff. And also, too, um, think about how dangerous the place is, and like how you want to accent that with your random encounters. And that's something important about random encounters too. Not every random encounter needs to be dangerous or even something to deal with. If your adventure site is a sort of mystical forest that's mostly about like exploring and looking for like particular plants and that kind of stuff, some of your random encounters might just be like grazing animals, or a noise in the distance that isn't really related to what's going on and that kind of stuff. So have fun with it. Keep the place in mind. Have fun with it. Use the random encounter chart to sort of like make the place feel alive and make the place feel lived in. Or if it's the spooky catacombs with all the spirits and undead, make it feel unlived in, I guess. Um, One thing, my second bit of advice, is to try and throw in one traveler and intruder, or traveler intruder type character. And just like I mentioned before, in the you might want to throw in like another adventuring party. I always think it's fun if the random encounter charts include at least one person who's like not supposed to be there. Some grave robbers, or like a scholar that got lost in a salvage yard, or like a wizard who teleported here by accident, that kind of stuff. And I think this is fun because one, that creates a sort of interesting dynamic for the players to deal with. They might try to become allies with a person. They might try to help them out. This might become a liability for them, or it could be connected to something else that's going on in the saga, and they could bring that problem to this other unrelated site. Um, it's also again just it keeps things interesting. It keeps things lively. So every time you come up with a random encounter chart, just keep in mind I gotta have one thing on here that just shouldn't be in here. Um, and something, whenever I'm making them, I always take uh, usually make the results 15 and 16. Usually make that my little weirdo intruder slash traveler encounter. So if that helps you remember to do so, I heartily recommend, you write it down or come up with your own technique for doing so. And finally, one of my favorite things, and this is also just true of adventure sites as well. Try to tell a bit of a story with the random encounters if you can, right? And like this doesn't have to be like a grand narrative. Um, so I mentioned before, just try to make one traveler intruder. You might use the random encounter chart to show that the inhabitants of this adventure site are looking for that intruder, right? So, like, say your intruder is a phantom thief of some kind, and they've stolen some cool thing and they're trying to find a way out of the adventure site before they're caught. You could have the other encounters be like patrols and like, a captain and that kind of stuff. And they're like scouring the area for this particular person and not the players. And it can be interesting too. Um, you might, if they're spirits, if this is a adventure site with a lot of undead, the random encounters could represent other individuals who have died in this place, who are wandering it as if they, were still trying to get out. Versus, like, say, you might have the guardian encounters in that particular situation be like the sort of uh, spirits that are tethered there, that are supposed to be there, that are like, that kind of stuff, and make the random encounters like skeletons or zombie-like individuals, wandering around trying to leave and that kind of stuff. And that gives a sense of foreboding and a sense of like kind of entrapment in there. That's a little story, that kind of stuff. Um, I am of the mindset that you can have almost every aspect of an adventure tell a little narrative, and I always think it's super fun to do that. They don't have to be complex. They don't have to be grand. They can just be little stories. Um, if you want to like have like kind of a sad forlorn story, one of the random encounters might be a beloved growl looking around for its owner who might be not with us anymore in one of the other rooms. And if the players figure this out, they might be like, okay, well, we gotta help this little guy out, maybe adopt him or that kind of stuff. Again, all this stuff in the end is to create fun, interesting choices for the players to make. And so, um, that's what I would do, or that's what I suggest you do when coming up with these encounters. Um, so anyway, this has been my sort of short advice on making encounters in Break. Hopefully, this is helpful, and you know these videos give you like a little extra nudge into running games and kind of like a little bit of extra advice, hopefully. If not, there'll be more videos. Hopefully by then I'll have figured out how to make ones that are a little higher quality, but we'll see. Um, anyway, I hope you all have a fine morning, evening, or afternoon whenever you happen to be watching this, and I'll see you next time.